Well, in a way, the book comes from a long conflict between anthropologists and economists. Over 200 years ago now, in 1776, Adam Smith wrote a theory about the origins of money. He now calls the barter theory. Once upon a time, people used to swap things with each other directly. If you do so, it eventually is going to create problems because, say I say, I'll give you 20 chickens for that cow. You don't need chickens, we can't make a deal. So eventually we create some medium of exchange to solve the problem. You still see this in economic textbooks, pretty much every one. The funny thing about it is that there's no evidence this ever happened. In fact, anthropologists have been scouring the world for 200 years trying to find anyone who actually does this, and remarkably enough, they don't exist. You can find a remarkable variety of different economic arrangements, but just not that. And economists make the rather reasonable complaint. Well, if you're going to tell us not to tell this story, what story should we tell? Where does money come from? And one of the things I was trying to do in the book is to answer that question. But the answer is something that I think that most economists really don't like very much, which is that the real history of money is a history of war and violence. All evidence seems to indicate that we're in a small community, what you really have is a series of gifts, favors, perhaps broad sense of debts and obligations, which are not precisely quantified. And what money really means is an exact system of equivalences, where you can say 20 chickens equals 1 cow. When people start making those kind of calculations, it's actually in a legal context. If there's been an act of violence, someone's killed or injured someone, there's often elaborate schedules of compensation. And that's exactly the context where people are going to be very exacting. They're going to demand an exact equivalence. If you don't have 20 cows, I want something of exactly the same value. In Irish and Welsh law codes, for example, they had schedules of exactly the worth of every single item that might be found in an ordinary person's house, even though most of those things you couldn't buy and sell at all, because you needed to do that in order to pay fines. So that link between violence or potential violence and the exact numerical quantification of value occurs over and over again. Markets, as it turns out, we're used to thinking of markets as something opposed to states. So that's the great conceptual trap of the 20th century. There's the state, there's the market. The question is how much you're going to balance one against the other. Actually, if you look at the history, impersonal markets tend to occur first around armies, around military operations. They're created often by governments as a way of provisioning soldiers. That's how coinage originates in India and China and Greece. You see the same, pretty much the same story, that kings have a problem, how to provision the army. If you have 10,000 people, 100,000 people in one place, they're just going to eat everything edible in a very short period of time. On the other hand, they're likely to be carrying little bits of gold and silver because that's what was considered loot. Well, the obvious thing to do is take those little bits of gold and silver, stamp your picture on it, and then say, all right, everyone in my kingdom has to give me one of those back again. Because if you do that, well, you've just employed your entire population feeding soldiers. And that link continues throughout history. Even if you look at the central banking system that we have today, paper money is created on the basis of military loans and remains the case to this day. So the real history of money and the real history of debt is closely linked to not only violence, but provisioning armies, creating military systems. And nothing's really changed in this regard. The financial architecture of the world economy today is built on US Treasury bonds, which are essentially used to fund the American military. Money essentially is circulating government military debt.